Hi, all, and welcome to episode 49 of Plain Speaking Sanjeev. In my last episode, I had talked about revenue metrics and how some of the revenue metrics which are commonly in use, such as RASK, revenue per ASK, or just yield, average fare, load factor, on their own are not particularly helpful because they don't capture the full picture and they also don't adjust for differences in stage length, differences in aircraft seating density, and so on and so forth. And I propose that the better metrics to compare performance and to set performance targets is revenue per flight and revenue per aircraft. Of course, when you're comparing across airlines, you need to equalize for different aircraft gauges and capacity. But if two airlines have similar aircraft types, say A320s or A320 and 737s, then you can compare revenue per flight to revenue per aircraft, I think, fairly accurately and get a good sense as to how airline A is performing relative to airline B. Today I want to talk about costs, and similar to the revenue side, measuring cost per ASK CASK, which is the most prevalent cost metric, is it can be quite misleading because of a couple of reasons. Number one, CASK is cost per available seat kilometer, which means that how much does it cost to fly one seat, whether it's occupied or not, 1 kilometer. Now, obviously, if you put more seats into the aircraft, then the average cost comes down. So that is called aircraft gauge. So that impacts the ratio, the cost per available seat kilometer. But very importantly, and surprisingly, it's not really practiced as much as it should be. There is another element that drives CASK and in turn drives RASK, which is stage length, which is how long is the flight in number of miles, or how long is the average flight across the network in number of miles. And why stage length important? Well, it's simply because of this. The first 30 minutes of the flight from take liftoff to the time you reach cruising altitude consumes fuel at about 2 times the rate of the fuel consumption at cruise, which means the first 30 minutes consumes twice as much fuel as every hour of subsequent cruising time. Now, if the flight is very short, say it's a 45-minute flight, then pretty much the entire flight, more than half the flight, it is consuming rate at 2x, and then it's descending, so there's no cruise to kind of normalize the fuel consumption rate. Whereas if you have a long flight, your first 30 minutes, which is consuming at 2x, gets averaged out over many hours of flying. So with longer stage lengths, your cost per flight hour or cost per block hour obviously comes down because you've got all these cruise hours there to reduce overall cost. So to put it very simply, a short flight will cost more per mile than a long flight. And because the cost per mile is more on a short flight, fares reflect that as well, which is why you don't see, if the flight is very short, say the flight is 1/4 the length of another flight, you won't necessarily see the fare at 1/4, you see the fare at maybe half, because fare costs and pricing doesn't come down directly proportional to the flight length reducing. Similarly, when you see a long flight, when you see a flight which is double the length of a shorter flight, it is not necessarily the case that the fare has to be double. It might be 1.5 times more because the entire cost doesn't double. The longer flight averages the cost down to a lower level. So anyhow, given all this background, I think on the cost side, the most relevant metrics to measure are again similar to the revenue side. It's your cost per flight, your total cost per flight, and your total cost per aircraft. Because essentially at the end of the day, it is your aircraft is your primary asset. Your measurement of revenue per flight or revenue per aircraft is giving you a very simple metric for revenue of return on your asset. And similarly, cost per flight and cost per aircraft tells you how much your asset is costing you. And when you look at the difference between the two, you get to a true picture of what is really happening. Another way of thinking about this, I'm using terms like revenue per flight, cost per flight. There's another term that is commonly used, which is called trip cost and trip revenue. So I am a believer, and I recommend this, even though I know there are differing opinions on this, that rather than measuring or being fixated on RASK and CASK as your primary measures for revenue performance and cost performance, we should look at trip revenue and trip cost, which is revenue per flight and cost per flight, and then look at the total revenue generated by your aircraft asset over the period, the month or the quarter, and compare it to the total cost. and you need to maximize the difference between revenue and cost in order to make money. So, I wanted to again demystify some of these cost and revenue metrics, explain why you can't just straight away apples to apples compare airlines to each other. You need to normalize for various things. Also explain the importance of the difference of stage lengths, and in the industry, there's a measurement called stage length adjustment, where you essentially use a formula, you plot the cost curve, as the distance increases, and based on that, you come up with a curve and a formula for that curve, equation for that curve, which you use to stage length adjust your the measures of RASK and CASK. Now, this is important again, separately speaking, because if you're looking at two airlines and you see one has higher RASK than the other, it doesn't mean that that airline is necessarily performing better on revenue. It could have a higher RASK because its average stage length is much shorter than the other airline. And like I said, when a stage length is shorter, both your cost and your revenue per mile is much higher. Therefore, you need to normalize, equate the stage lengths for the two airlines to make an apples to apples comparison. So that is true on the revenue side, that is true on the cost side as well. Similarly, when it comes to aircraft gauge, just because one airline has a higher RASK than the other, it doesn't mean, even if the stage length is the same, it doesn't necessarily mean that the first airline is performing better, even though the stage length may be the same, or you may have normalized for the stage length. Because if you're flying a smaller aircraft, then your RASK will be higher because your denominator in terms of seat kilometers is smaller. So mathematically, your RASK tends to be higher. But your CASK is also higher because again, the denominator is smaller, so the cost is amortized over a smaller denominator. So airlines flying small aircraft will have higher RASK and higher CASK than an airline flying larger aircraft if you equalize for the stage length. An airline flying a longer average stage length will have a lower RASK and lower CASK than an airline flying a shorter average stage length. So in order to make apples to apples comparisons, you need to adjust the RASK and the CASK for both size of the aircraft, which is gauge, and stage length. And finally, all these are unit metrics. End of the day, the bottom line is how much is your aircraft asset producing for you, and is it producing more revenue than it is costing you to operate the aircraft, and that is how you get to the bottom line. So I encourage everybody to start looking not just at RASK and CASK, but to start looking at trip revenue and trip cost, and revenue per aircraft per month and cost per aircraft per month as your entire set of metrics to fully understand how you are doing relative to your own performance and budget, and how you are doing after you normalize and equate compared to other airlines. Hope that is helpful. See you again next episode. Thanks. Bye.